Well, welcome everyone. I'm Kathleen Enright, the President and CEO of Grantmakers for Effective Organizations. And I am just thrilled to be with all of you today for our webinar, Investing in Change, Funding Collective Impact. I hope you will join us as we live tweet today using the hashtag Collective Impact. And as we get started, I want to introduce, I'm joined by three excellent panelists who we will be hearing from in just a moment. The first is Faye Hanley Brown. She's the Managing Director of FSG, and she has worked directly with many groups embarking on collective impact efforts, so she can share some themes and observations that cut across a variety of efforts. We also have Emily Tao Jackson, who's the Executive Director of the Tao Foundation. Her foundation has done impressive work in juvenile justice reform using a collective impact approach. So Emily will share some of her observations in the process that they've been a part of. And Ken Thompson, who's a program officer from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, will share how Gates is participating in a collective impact initiative to close the achievement gap in their local community. So welcome, Faye, Emily, and Ken. I look forward to the conversation with all of you. Before we get started, I just want to say how pleased I am and how pleased Geo is to co-host this event with FSG. Clearly, FSG has tapped into a set of issues that many of us were already grappling with, or now at the very least find ourselves quite curious about. Many in the Geo community have been experimenting with collaborative approaches and support for networks over a number of years in a hope to achieve more progress more quickly. So we are very excited to learn with and from FSG as they move forward with their collective impact work. Now, the attendance at this webinar alone is testament to the interest. There are nearly 300 of you joining on this call, which is quite amazing. I'm sure that for many of you, the question that you're considering and the reason that you joined this call is how can we combine our resources and our efforts with others in order to make real progress in our communities? It's a simple question that is quite complex to answer, and it's also at the heart of collective impact. Collective impact is a disciplined form of collaboration. It requires grant makers to flex some new muscles and to let go of some long-held ways of operating. So we'll talk a bit more about how that plays out today. Now, before I turn to Faye Hanley Brown, who will provide us with a bit of a quick overview of collective impact, I want to acknowledge that we're still in the early days of understanding how best to make progress on incredibly complex, messy, long-standing problems. So we will undoubtedly learn more in the weeks and months ahead. However, FSG has made a powerful contribution in their framing of the 5 conditions that enable collective impact and in their stories of implementation. Now, I actually happened to be talking to someone yesterday who served on the White House Commission for Community Solutions. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, the Commission looked at 12 community collaboratives that had made at least a 10% difference on a community-wide metric. So that is undoubtedly those were approaches that could be characterized as collective impact approaches. And as I look back at what they learned, many of the fundamentals that the Commission came to are much the same as what FSG has described. They talk about a common agenda. They talk about the use of data to both set the agenda and improve over time. They talk about the presence of an influential champion in the early days. So clearly, several other efforts are triangulating on some of the same fundamentals that are inherent to the collective impact approach. So our goal for the next hour with the conversation with Faye and Emily and Ken, you can switch the slide, is to help many of you see yourselves in the collective impact storyline and to give examples of the different approaches that have worked in different contexts. So we'll start with an overview from Faye, and you can switch the slide again. And then we will move into a moderated conversation between Emily and Ken and Faye with the hope of keeping the discussion lively. Now, in order for you to get engaged in the conversation, please use the question bar, which is at the bottom of your screen. Our friends at FSG will be compiling those questions, and we'll try to get to as many of them, at least as many of the themes as we possibly can over the course of the conversation. So with that, I turn it to Faye.
Great. Thanks so much, Kathleen. I'm delighted to be with you here today and to have so many organizations joining us on the webinar. And as Kathleen mentioned, before we jump into the discussion with Ken and with Emily, we wanted to take about 10 minutes or so to provide some context around collective impact and the benefits to funders of engaging in this type of collaboration, but also to identify the range of roles that funders can play and some key success factors for funders to consider in this work. So next slide, please. I'll begin with a brief recap of collective impact, which, as many of you know, is an approach my colleagues John Kania and Mark Kramer first wrote about in the Stanford Social Innovation Review almost 2 years ago. Collective impact is, at its heart, about systems change. It's a highly structured cross-sector collaboration focused on addressing a specific social or environmental problem. And as we researched cross-sector partnerships that have produced consistent and large-scale change over time, there were 5 key components of collective impact that we identified and that you can see here: a common agenda, shared measurement, mutually reinforcing activities, continuous communication among all the stakeholders, and finally, backbone support. I'm not going to go into detail on these elements here, but we've found that several of these elements, and in particular shared measurement and backbone capacity, are frequently missing from typical collaborations that we see in the field. And yet we found that all 5 are really important for getting to large-scale change. Next slide, please. So we've also found that collective impact is applicable across really any complex social problem where there's no single solution and where it takes multiple stakeholders working adaptively together to solve a problem. And what's really exciting about this is that we've seen real evidence of change across many sectors. In education, where the Strive effort in Cincinnati has seen 81% of measures in student achievement trending in the right direction versus only 68% 2 years ago. We've seen it in health. Shape Up Somerville, which is one of the efforts we've written about, is in Somerville, Massachusetts. And they've been able to lower the body mass index for the overweight children in their community by as much as 15% in a relatively short period of time. And in the environment, the Elizabeth River Project in Virginia has resulted in more than 1,000 acres of wetland that's been restored and dozens of new species of fish and shellfish being introduced into that river. So lots of results. We have seen that. But I think what's important to note is that in all of the examples that we've studied or worked with, a funder or funders have played an absolutely critical role in catalyzing and convening major stakeholders around an issue. Next slide, please. So if you're a funder, why invest in collective impact? The funders we've talked to name a number of benefits from taking this approach, and first and foremost, greater impact. By supporting a collective impact effort that allows multiple stakeholders to come together around a specific issue and clear measures of success, funders are able to significantly increase their leverage beyond just a handful of grantees. So rather than just relying on single grants to individual organizations, collective impact engages multiple partners working towards the same goals, many of which may not even be your grantees. And it allows for a holistic, systemic approach with a strong emphasis on data and on continuous learning. So impact is clearly the primary reason for doing this. But a second set of benefits that we've seen also is increased efficiency and leverage for resources. And that, of course, is particularly important now when there's such a scarcity of resources, both public and private. greater coordination, and because data is being used, funding can go to things that are working versus not working, which leads to a more efficient use of existing resources, both public and private. And while the primary emphasis is clearly on doing better with the resources that we have at hand, we have also seen examples where collective efforts that have clear and measurable goals are able to attract additional funding to the issue. So amplifying impact, increasing efficiency of resources. The third area that we've seen is that collective impact drives alignment among stakeholders. So when you have truly mutually reinforcing activities, there is less duplication of services, but there's also really the ability for all the actors that are working on a problem to be seeing the problem and learning simultaneously together. And that really allows the group to take advantages of opportunities that individual organizations normally wouldn't be able to. Next slide, please. So it's important to note that collective impact does require a significant shift from business as usual for funders. Some of the major shifts include moving from funding individual grantees who work separately from one another to really thinking about funding a long-term process for change around a specific problem. And what we've seen is that this means that rather than predetermining how you're going to solve a problem, a funder must be open to working in partnership with others and helping to hold that creative tension among the group to jointly solve the problem. So getting to joint problem solving has real implications for many of the traditional funder activities. Take capacity building. In addition to building the capacity of individual organizations, funders also need to focus on building the capacity of multiple organizations to work effectively together. That can mean bringing stakeholders together and investing in infrastructure, like shared measurement systems or backbone organizations, which, as we've seen, are so important to the success of a collective impact effort. This also has implications for evaluation. So rather than simply evaluating individual grants, funders can really think about evaluating progress toward a social goal and really thinking about a focus on contribution rather than attribution. And we've also seen that this has implications for how funders work with each other. In many cases, we've seen funder groups that have been organized within collective impact efforts where funders are more actively coordinating with one another and really sharing lessons learned. So overall, we see that this just requires a flexible and adaptive way of working that perhaps more so than most funders are used to. Next slide, please. It's also just, I think, very important to call out that funders can engage in collective impact efforts in a wide variety of roles. Some funders play the role of catalyst, like Emily and Ken on our webinar today, where they play a very active role in initiating a collective impact effort. It can convene partners, attract funding. We've seen other funders, in fact, play the role of the backbone organization and actually play the central coordinating role of the collective impact effort. And many, many more we've seen as participants that play a very important role in implementation. Next slide, please. I think it's also worth noting that funder roles can vary quite a bit over the life of a collective impact effort. So what you see on this slide is really just an illustrative set, but some of the concrete roles that we have seen funders play in collective impact efforts. So if you take the startup phase, or initiating action, funders can support data collection and research to really make the case for change in the community. We often see them serving on governance committees, and of course using their considerable convening power to bring key stakeholders to the table around an issue, or in some cases to broker relationships between organizations that don't know each other or might have a rocky history. As you get further into collective impact, so in the second and third phases, as the effort begins to coalesce around a common agenda and shared measures, and you're getting a backbone infrastructure put in place, funders can play a critical role in helping to support that infrastructure, the shared measurement and backbone organizations. Again, we've seen that they can play a governance role or perhaps engage with a work group that's been formed around the issue. They can align their evaluation to the common shared measures and encourage their grantees and other actors to do so as well. and they can build the capacity of stakeholders to more effectively plan and work together. So we've seen funders helping to fund group planning processes or continuous improvement or even leadership training among the communities, the players in the community. And of course, we can see that funders can fund discrete initiatives that are identified by the group and that are aligned with their own missions. But it's really important to call out that in all collective impact efforts that we've been involved with or studied, funders have really played all of these critical roles, which are clearly both monetary and non-monetary. Next slide, please. So finally, what we wanted to do is to share some key success factors that we have seen from successful engagement of funders in this work. And I'm sure that Emily and Ken will share their personal experiences with us today as well. These key success factors really fall into three categories: institutional adaptability, culture shift, and long-term orientation. So let's take the first one, institutional adaptability. One of the key success factors that we've seen for funders in collective impact, and not just for funders, but really all actors, is flexibility. So really being able to seize on opportunities as they arise, which for funders often means working outside of traditional grant cycles. Collective impact also requires some new skill sets for some funders, including facilitation or direct community engagement. The second key success factor that we've seen is that a real culture shift is often required. This means living with some uncertainty, as the answers to these complex problems are simply not known from the start. Collective impact also creates a different power dynamic, or it can, between funders and grantees, between funders and other organizations that aren't grantees but that are working towards solving this problem, and often between funders. Funding collective impact infrastructure, like backbone organizations and shared measurement systems, may also be a cultural shift for funders that may be more used to funding direct services. So really some big shifts there. So we've got institutional adaptability, a real culture shift, and the third one that's also really key is long-term orientation. What we're talking about here is systems change, and that doesn't happen in a grant cycle or in a year. So it's important that funders really commit to long-term change, which may also mean that they're measuring progress in different ways, using interim milestones or process measures, like relationship building, for example. So these key success factors, institutional adaptability, cultural shift, and having a long-term orientation, may be easier or harder for different funders, but we've heard from many funders that they can be extremely beneficial and have really better positioned them to achieve large-scale change. So that's a brief overview of the critical roles that we've seen funders play, as well as some of the key success factors for engaging in collective impact. I'm going to pass it back to you, Kathleen, so we can get our panel conversation started.
Well, thank you so much, Faye, for that fantastic overview. And quickly, I noticed a question come in. One of the participants would like you to just say a couple more words about the role of the backbone organization.
Sure, I'm happy to do that. So what we've seen, and I mentioned this, is that in typical collaborations, the backbone organization role is missing, and we see it as an absolutely critical part of collective impact. And essentially what the backbone organization does, and it may be one organization, it may be multiple organizations, is help to coordinate the efforts of all the stakeholders that are working on the collective impact effort. So that essentially means that they are helping to maintain the focus on the common agenda. In many cases, it means that they are helping to collect the data for shared measures and synthesize that data and help all the players to assess what's working, what isn't working. They're helping to connect the dots between the different efforts that are underway around the problem. And in many cases, they're also doing things like building public will around change, or working with stakeholders to affect policy change, or mobilizing funding around the effort. So it really is very much a central coordinating role that is critical for holding the whole effort together over time.
Thank you. That's quite helpful. And welcome again, Emily and Ken. Thanks for being with us.
My pleasure.
Glad to be here.
Great. So we're going to move into the moderated conversation, and we're going to hope that this is lively and that Ken and Emily and Faye are all building on each other's points. So we'll just start off with asking each of them to just give us a brief overview of their foundation and the collective impact effort that they are involved in. So Emily, do you mind going first?
Sure. So the Tao Foundation is a family foundation. We're located in Connecticut. I'm both the executive director and also a trustee and family member. We've made substantial investments at the level of about over $2 million a year in juvenile justice reform at both the local and national levels. And although we do fund some direct services for court-involved youth and their families, we have a strong bent towards supporting advocacy and networks. So we chose to focus on this issue, the issue of kids in the juvenile justice system, because we found that it was really an area where there were very, very deep and negative social consequences from a very costly system that was showing really poor outcomes, both for communities and youth. So yet, at the same time, there was very little private interest or support for programming or advocacy for juvenile justice youth. So for us, that translated into a tremendous opportunity to make a difference. So over the past decade or more, we've been a lead partner in what, in retrospect, has been a collective impact effort to reform the Connecticut juvenile justice system. Working collaboratively with a very diverse group of stakeholders toward shared goals around system improvement really has resulted in dramatic positive reform and in turn affected tens of thousands of young people in our state. So we felt like that was a fabulous accomplishment, but we always strive to try to take what we do to scale and do better. So toward that goal, more recently we've worked to replicate that success through an intentional collective impact effort to reform New York State's juvenile justice system. They're our neighbor and has similar issues, although very, very complex system. So that process began about 2 years ago, starting with the creation of a shared vision for the system that led to a strategic plan with goals focused on both positive youth outcomes and improved public safety. And over the past year, we've moved into the implementation phase of the plan and are already starting to see some really dramatic progress.
That is absolutely fantastic, Emily. Thank you for that. And quickly, Ken, will you also share the work that you've been engaged in with Gates in Seattle?
Happy to. Excuse me, happy to, and I will try to be as quick as I can because I see lots of really interesting questions coming in from folks. So good morning from the West Coast, everyone. I'm Ken Thompson. I'm a program officer at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I work in our Seattle offices. The Gates Foundation is a very large international foundation. Most of our work is done overseas and concentrated in the developing world. We do have a number of programs we work on in the United States, and I am part of one of those teams. It's a team called the Pacific Northwest team, and it's in essence our local giving team. We do about $35 million in investing on this team in Washington State and the Portland metro area. And it was really the Gates Foundation's first giving came out of this. It was their commitment to the local community. And so we've always had a slightly different way of working in a way. So although I'm here representing a very large national, international funder, the particular team I'm on has always worked very hard to be directly responsive to community needs. And we've worked mainly in two areas in our geographic area. One is human services of all kinds, but with a particular focus on family homelessness. And then education has been the other area we've worked on extensively, although we do continue to work in some other general support areas for the nonprofit sector as well. And so the work we got involved in a couple of years ago is a local cradle-to-college and career effort called the Roadmap Project. And that's an initiative in South Seattle and adjoining South King County, an area with about 250,000 young people aged 0 to 25 in it. And our work there is to work across the education continuum, early learning through college completion, to double the number of kids who grow up in this area who will get a post-secondary credential of some kind, a certificate, a college degree, something that helps you get a living wage job, because the numbers here are frighteningly low versus the community, which has a very high education rate. That's because people move here from other places. But if you grow up in the Seattle area and you're low income, only 24% of all kids were going on to get a post-secondary credential. So we're working hard on a specific goal to double those numbers by 2020. And the reason we started down this path was we wanted to look hard at how we had been doing our giving in our local community. We had a good 10 years of pretty intensive effort in Washington State and the Portland metro area. And while we had seeded a lot of really great work in individual organizations, it was very challenging to tell whether it was adding up to the impact we wanted to have. So we wanted to get more specific and more to work harder on a specific issue, which we chose educational attainment in the end, as I mentioned. But we wanted to remain really responsive to community input, and collective impact is kind of this great Goldilocks place, as I think about it. It's right in the middle. It's not too hot or too cold. It incorporates both the best pieces of really hearing back from the community and relying on the community to produce the ideas that will make the change happen in communities, and helps us as a funder be specific and focused and have a very concrete goal we're working against.
Thanks for that overview, Ken. And I just want to get right into a conversation with all three of you. And let's start by focusing on these roles. Faye defined a variety of roles that funders can potentially play in this effort. So, Emily, why don't I start with you to talk about the roles that you have played and how that's changed over time at the Tao Foundation.
Sure. So initially, we definitely acted as the catalyst, bringing together a diverse group of folks that have been working very independently, working very hard independently previously, but not really getting a lot of traction. So really getting the excitement together around coming together and with the goal to set up, collective vision and strategies to transform the system together. And then, we have regularly acted as a convener, a lot of times between groups that are usually on opposite sides of the table and have not worked together. So in the legal system, you have people like prosecutors and public defenders and judges and probation officers who do not regularly meet collaboratively. They usually meet when they're taking opposite sides. So a foundation like ours has really used our ability to be a neutral player to bring those folks together. And then as the process has evolved, we've been fairly active participants, both serving on steering committees and working groups of these efforts, and kind of motivating the group to keep moving along and offering a lot of support when it seems appropriate and necessary.
What about you, Ken? What are the roles that you have found Gates playing the most?
So all three of the roles that Emily just mentioned we're involved with as well. And one way I would answer that is by thinking just kind of personally as my job as a program officer, which has changed quite a bit from how we were working previously. I'm much more integrated at kind of this participant level in a lot of the work. So I am hearing a lot more directly from a large array of our grantees and people who aren't our grantees but are key partners in this work. And I'm spending a lot more time thinking about how to connect work together. It's really the collective impact work is very much about collaboration and building a network. And so much more of my role is about playing this kind of glue-ish kind of role, especially kind of within the world of other funders working here as well, to see how we as funders can also work collectively together, which I think for everyone on this call who's a funder knows that is a whole challenge in itself.
It's a really interesting dimension you bring into this, Ken, thinking about not only the roles that your institutions play and how those are shifting over time, but also your individual role. And it sounds like you're acting as a, what some people term a network weaver or connector, which definitely is different than how many, the jobs that many program officers are charged with doing. Faye, you had mentioned in your presentation that some funders play the role of the backbone organization. Can you give us an example of one of those situations?
Yes, happy to. I would say that the majority of funders that we see play more of the catalyst or participant roles, but we have seen examples of funders like the Calgary Homeless Foundation in Calgary in Canada that actually are playing that backbone or coordinating role. So what the Calgary Homeless Foundation did was they really helped to convene all the stakeholders around the issue of homelessness in Calgary. And they did that in the beginning through data, but they also have now ended up playing the central coordinating role of the backbone. So they manage the data collection and synthesis. They really help to guide the vision and the strategy and connect the dots between the different providers in the community. And they were really able to play off of two real core skills that they had as a funder, their convening power and obviously sort of knowledge around the issue, but also data. So they brought a very sophisticated HMIS system to Calgary, and data has really been central to that effort.
And I saw a question come in from one of our participants that is about the backbone organizations and how they are sustained over the long term. Can you share a little bit about what you've observed in sustaining the backbone efforts?
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of that depends on the form of the backbone itself. So we have seen examples, and Emily can certainly talk about this example from her juvenile justice work, where the backbone actually becomes a part of a government entity. So in the case of New York, actually sits within the governor's office. And that's where we've seen essentially a redirection of existing public resources that allow that backbone to be sustained over time. In some cases, backbones are nonprofit organizations, and in that case, then they rely more on public and private sources, and where there needs to be sort of some ongoing support. But we really encourage funders to think about the backbone organization as highly leveraged investments, simply because if you think about the overall funding that backbone organizations are actually helping to coordinate, reducing the duplication of effort, really helping to direct resources to where the most traction is happening through the use of data and continuous learning, there's a tremendous amount of leverage that simply by funding the backbone that funders can get.
Emily, did you want to add anything from your experience about the backbone, the sustainability of backbone organizations?
Yeah, well, in both our efforts, both in Connecticut and New York, the backbone has been we originally were part of the funding mechanism, and then it very quickly moved to be totally government supported. So we saw that as a huge win in both cases, that we were able to step out as the funder but still participate. And that I saw a couple of questions that came in around, do you compromise, like could the donor really be the funder of the backbone? And I think in certain cases it can probably work on an ongoing basis, but we were very happy to see that we could then step out and let it took on a life of its own, and the folks who created the plan really took ownership of it. So we saw that as a big win.
Absolutely. That sounds like a fantastic outcome that many are probably striving for. Well, so let's talk a little bit about how these roles that each of you have played are different from the roles that foundations typically play.
Well,
Emily?
I'll jump in with that one because I think Faye mentioned before it could be a real stretch beyond normal business as usual, and I think that for us it wasn't such a big stretch because we have kind of an entrepreneurial approach to our grant making, and we're willing to take some risks and do things that aren't a normal process. But I think a lot of foundations are very locked into that grantor-grantee dynamic, and as Ken mentioned, you're working in a collaborative effort, so you need to really be a partner versus a funder. And that requires a lot of relationship building and trust, and you have to break down that wall of, we're the people with the money, and so you have to do what we say, or that you have a set idea of how things should play out. So I think willingness not to be prescriptive and go in and say, this is how we want it to turn out, but be open to having the group come up with their own shared vision is a stretch for a lot of funders.
Yeah, I could
if I
see
could
that.
jump in on that, I think that we have seen that collective impact can affect some of the traditional relationships between funders and grantees, as Emily's saying. And I want to note that there are some misperceptions in the field that collective impact means that funders must cede all control to nonprofits. Or we've also seen the opposite misperception, that somehow collective impact is a way for funders to force nonprofits to do the same things. And I think it's just a key point to make here that collective impact efforts are neither about funder control or nonprofit control, but really, as Emily's saying, that they are an effort to focus on bringing together multiple perspectives of many stakeholders that are informed about the problem in order to create better solutions. So I think that's a really important point to make, that this is really about joint problem solving.
Yeah. Which is complex work, as you guys can attest. So I'm wondering if we can turn quickly to some challenges. What has been hard? What have you come up against that you're either still challenged by or that you've already made it through in these collective impact efforts?
So I can start with that. I'll do kind of one kind of out in the real world challenge, and then one like inside the funder world challenge. And one of the big challenges we've gotten to, and I've seen a couple of questions come along these lines, is, how will we know this is working, and what's different about it, and how do we get past just a lot of talk and planning to a different kind of action? And at the heart of this is a question about accountability, right? Like, what's different about this that's gonna make something different happen than a lot of, and certainly, collective impact. There's been, over the years, many different kinds of ways of bringing communities together in collaboration. And so this is this is not resolved, right? We're working our way through this, and we are working on a couple of assumptions, and one is that some of these really challenging problems take people talking who don't normally talk to each other. So the example in our roadmap project work here is that there just hadn't been a big history of the K-12 system talking to the post-secondary system. And so just a huge advance has been in the area of the 7 superintendents sitting down and talking with the 5 community college presidents and really beating out and starting to work out actual tangible ways that they will work to ease the transitions between their two systems. And they're already doing things as starting as something as simple as just sending the community college is sending a letter to every single graduating senior telling them that there's a spot for them at the community college. That had never happened before. And then to more ambitious things like trying to solve really challenging lack of math preparedness once you get to community college, to go back and do some deep analyses on math transcripts for all the students who do go to the colleges and figuring out what was working and what's not, which might lead to some major changes down the road in how both the K-12 and post-secondary systems think about math and who needs what kind of math to be successful. So these kinds of things, and we think those will lead to some of the specific numerical changes we're looking for in post-secondary completion rates. But it is true, we're at the stage of, at least in this work, just seeing process changes happening. And then I'll just quickly note an internal challenge, which just echoes a lot of, I think, what we've talked about to date. It does. It calls on us to think differently about our jobs, and as program officers certainly, and as directors of philanthropic programs, because it does require us also to say we're not going to sit back and tell people what to do. We are going to be a member of a large community that's trying to make some decisions and work differently. Because clearly, funders also have been working for 20, 30, 40 years in the Seattle area to try and improve education, and it just hasn't happened. So, I would say we need to also look at ourselves and our own practice and understand and think about doing things differently in the world. But that's not an easy, that's a culture change, and it won't happen quickly.
Well, Ken, I heard a little cheer go out from the nonprofits on this call when a leading funder said that you're not going to tell them how to do their work. And I think that that's a very forward-thinking, reasonable approach, and one that hopefully will get us all where we're trying to go. Other challenges that either Emily or Faye would like to weigh in on?
Well, this is Emily, and I found one of the biggest challenges was convincing my colleagues in the funding community to join forces with us, particularly in the New York effort where it required raising some additional funds. We had a strong commitment from the state of New York to put in really the lion's share of the funding, and our foundation was putting some money on the table, and it was very difficult for our colleagues, even though they were really committed to juvenile justice issues, to get beyond the bureaucracy of their everyday foundation operations. And I think we built a lot of structures within our foundations on grant cycles, and I heard a great quote last week, which is, you can't solve life cycle problems on a grant cycle. And I thought that really applied to the fact that, we tend to try to be very nimble, and most foundations are not. They're really stuck with their grant cycle process, and unless they have discretionary money, staff people are not really able to go outside of those boundaries. And sometimes things don't go on that same calendar, and there are moments where opportunity is ripe and we need to seize that opportunity. And I think we have a lot of barriers to overcome in our field to be able to be really effective in this way.
Faye, was there anything you wanted to add?
No, I think that's right. A lot of this, we've discussed, is a mindset shift or a culture shift among funders that allow them to see the system and solving problems in a systemic way in partnership with other partners. But I think that both Ken and Emily are speaking to that.
Yeah. Well, there's a follow-up question for Ken about how you actually get nonprofits to believe, to trust that you're open to their ideas and that you don't have it all figured out.
There's a long answer to that, which we don't have time for, but my short answer is show up, right? Show up at lots of things other than just meetings talking about the specific funding opportunity. And listen, right? Show up and listen and be there. And I know that is challenging if you're a program officer on a national foundation and you're having to fly across the country to see places or to visit places and projects that you might be funding. So that's where I think, if I can put a plug on for some work hopefully to come in the future is how do we get a better collaboration between local funders who can do this kind of more deeper work and be there to listen and understand, and some of the great resources that more national funders bring but can't be as present in specific communities. So maybe that's another webinar for another time, but it's an important question we need to start tackling.
So is it your instinct that it might be easier for place-based, for you're a program officer in a place, even though you're with an international foundation, because showing up is a big part of the equation?
Yes, is my short answer to that.
Yeah, okay. Well, thanks.
I would agree on that. This is Emily, and also we've had some very successful collaborative funding with big national foundations that really value our sort of on-the-ground knowledge and the relationships that we have and that builds confidence for them to come in maybe with, with some larger amounts of funding that, because of our relationship and the trust there. So that's been a great leveraging tool for being a local, regional foundation.
Well, thank you so much for your candor about the challenges. And now let's turn quickly to talking about measuring progress. This is, a complex question in any circumstances, but the complexity increases when you're talking about a multi-party approach to solving a really complex community challenge. So let me ask Faye if you are seeing some progress on shared measurement and how foundations and their colleagues who are involved in collective impact efforts are cracking that question.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And as we've been talking about, collective impact is about systems change, and systems change takes a long time, often measured in years, to see real change on the ground. I think one of the nice things about collective impact is that it has essentially a built-in goal and built-in specific shared measures. So those measures that are identified and measured over time by the whole group. So you really can see whether you're making progress or not. But we think that collective impact requires really a fundamentally different approach to evaluation from the more episodic approach that many funders currently take. These are problems that are constantly changing, they're solutions that are emerging, and you really can't wait 5 years to evaluate and see if something has worked. We've been talking a lot about shared measurement, but also really a different approach to evaluation that we call developmental evaluation, which is focused on complexity and continuous learning and builds from the work of Michael Quinn Patton. But the basic idea is that there needs to be much shorter feedback loops in place for information among the different partners working on the problem. And that means not every year, but really every week or every several weeks. There's a great example of this in Canada, and that's the Vibrant Cities Poverty Reduction Initiative. The backbone for that effort is the Tamarack Institute, and they essentially help the different partners to put together a 2-page weekly outcomes diary. And what this has done is really created a dialogue around what's happening in the community. And obviously poverty reduction is a very complex, multi-layered issue to tackle. And it's also created an openness to unanticipated changes that the different players can then jump on. So in this work, I would say that in general, we've seen a greater focus on interim and process changes. We recently published a blog post in Stanford Social Innovation Review in partnership with the Greater Cincinnati Foundation about the role of backbone organizations, but also just talking about different ways to measure process change for collective impact efforts, like whether you're seeing individual partners work more closely aligned with a common agenda, or if there's more collaborative work going on, or if there's policy change. So you're still focused on clearly change in the ground and moving the needle on that issue, but there's just a lot more emphasis on measuring those process changes along the way.
Either Emily or Ken, do you have any examples of interim measures or process changes that you've looked to make the case for your continued involvement to any of your key stakeholders?
Well, we have, particularly in the New York case, clear examples of progress that I think can easily be measured. In fact, I think they can be measured more easily than direct service grants, where you're looking at individual changes in individual people, because this is really quite exponential change. So in New York, the fact that the public partners, in our case, which are state agencies and the governor's office, have committed personnel time and money to the backbone support. To me, that indicates very strong evidence that they value the participants value what this backbone organization is accomplishing. And we've also created a set of shared performance metrics that are going to be tracking and following our success as it moves forward. And there's just clear commitment from the state to keep things moving forward, but it's both on systems change and also accountability. So creating a shared data system for the first time and using that data system to both see how the system is working for young people, but also to hold system leaders accountable to themselves. So I think those are very exciting things that can be measured.
Definitely.
And my add to this is that we're perhaps a unique part of the Gates Foundation in terms of our stated desire to interact with and be a deep part of community processes. But we are also at the Gates Foundation, and we wouldn't have gotten into this without specific measures on the table, right? And one of the great things about the Roadmap project and about how collective impact is structured overall is that it really encourages you to set a very specific goal you're aiming for. And so the way it's constructed in this community is there's not just the kind of end goal in 2020, but there are goals all along the way in 2014 and 2017 about whether we're progressing against those goals, and an annual report is produced about progress on it. And there are measures between kindergarten readiness and post-secondary completion that we're tracking as well, so within the early learning community, K-12 community. The post-secondary community, and we're developing measures that are important on the social-emotional development of children and students, so that community-based organizations and housing authorities and public health departments can also understand how they're contributing to multiple measures of success towards school completion. So that is, I think, a critical piece of this. We'll literally know how we're doing, and people working in all of those areas who might just work in middle schools can understand how the community has defined success, and it's just turned out to be a kind of amazing way to engage lots of people. We thought it would be mainly, in the kind of carrot and stick conversation. I think people are often afraid of measures and think it's going to be all stick. You're going to get whacked with if you don't meet the measure. But it's really turned out to be way more carrot than stick. People are excited to understand how the neighboring school district is doing so well on kindergarten readiness. What did they do? Well, it turns out actually they did a lot of intentional stuff to engage early learning providers. Great. The next school district is like, oh, teach us how to do that. And, they're capable, then they start to build the bench to meet that particular metric the community has agreed on. So
sounds like it starts a snowballing effect.
It really does. It's really surprised me because I really thought the data thing was going to be mainly stick, and it's really, really carrot, and I would encourage people to go that way. And then I would just echo in terms of how else you can tell if it's working is a lot of what Emily said. People show up, right? And the highest levels of leadership continue to show up 2 years later at pretty frequent coordinating meetings. And while that's not exactly a student outcome, it does show people are willing to think differently and behave differently, at least through a planning process.
I was going to say, This is Emily. I was going to say that if people are looking for real results information, I can make available, we've tracked the Connecticut story and used sort of 7 indicators in the juvenile justice system where really transformative change has happened, and I can make that brief available for participants maybe through, wherever the webinar is going to be posted so people can see the real data of what's happened in Connecticut.
Thank you, Emily. Well, I cannot believe that we are almost out of time. This has just flown by, and I really appreciate your candor and your thoughtfulness in your responses. And before we wrap up, I would really appreciate it if each of you would just think about what advice that you would give your colleague funders who might be interested in participating in a collective impact effort.
Sure. Well, I'll start. This is Emily, and I wanted to just pipe in sort of as a small foundation and say that, as a small funder, we're always looking for leveraging opportunities, and we know that unless we limit ourselves to trying to solve very small problems, we're going to need colleagues and partners to help us. So collective impact style of doing things really lets a small foundation play an important and meaningful role beyond just providing the money. And, as I said earlier, we can use our tools of convening and facilitating and creating a space for partners that can actually do the heavy lifting, like our government partners. And so, I would suggest setting aside a small part of their giving budget to try an effort like this is a good way to start, and you'd be surprised how quickly you can get a great return on investment.
You certainly have done that, Emily. Ken or Faye?
Maybe we'll give Faye the last word on this, given her perspective across a whole lot of different collective impact efforts. For the one here in Seattle and South King County, I think I'll riff off of my prior answer and saying that don't back away from setting an ambitious goal. I think I've seen as I've tracked other Cradle to College and career efforts, some have set big goals, some haven't. I will just say that it's really been a motivating factor in this particular community to get people to the table and to think differently, and that depending on kind of what the nature of your collective impact-oriented effort is, I'd say it's been really beneficial in this project to involve multiple school districts and multiple community colleges and, of course, multiple CBOs and many other folks, because it really, it's not quite that you're setting up a competition between them, but you're creating a learning community so that one group can learn a lot from the folks in the other systems.
Faye?
No, I couldn't agree more with Ken. I mean, I guess I would just really encourage funders to think about the issues that they are working on that are really ripe for this approach, that are complex, where there's a need for multiple stakeholders to come together around the issue, and where sort of the traditional grant-making approach is realistically not going to get them to the kinds of change that they need. And so for those kinds of problems, I'd really encourage funders to consider a more collaborative collective impact approach. It's clearly not for everyone, but I will say that because of the long-term resources that funders have, because of the convening power, their ability to be nimble, funders really do have a unique role to play in solving complex problems like this, and in getting organizations to look up from their day-to-day work and help to lift the lens to solving a specific problem, and then getting those stakeholders together to jointly problem solve. So I would just really encourage funders to think about which issues they feel are ripe for this, and then what kinds of roles that they can play to really get to sustainable large-scale social change.
Well, very well said, Faye. Thank you for that. So there were so many fantastic, insightful questions that we were not able to answer, but not to worry. The panelists will be blogging the answers to those questions in the weeks ahead on the FSG blog. So stay tuned to fsg.org to get your question answered. Also, there will be a recording of this webinar and the slides available in the next day or so on fsg.org, so take a look there. Right as we conclude, a quick survey will pop up on your screen, so if you would please fill that out to help FSG improve their webinars, they would much appreciate it. So with that, I would love to thank these wonderful panelists who were candid and thoughtful and incredibly generous with their remarks and their time. So thank you, Faye and Ken and Emily, so very much.
Thank you.
And I also would like to thank all of you. There were 288 people logged into this call, and you chose to spend your coffee time or your lunch time with us, and we very much appreciate it. Thanks again, and take care.